in the course of my day job, I have to walk back and forth to the room where I do therapy at my different schools no less than 14 times in a day. I was trying to figure that out the other day, how many times I have to, go out the door and go get kids, and I see about 14 kids and moving back and forth. And so along these journeys, I inevitably pass different children, faculty, staff, and I'm a very social person, if y'all haven't know that about me. I like to greet people every time I see them, and I'm the guy in Walmart that everybody's avoiding, and Amy hates to go to Walmart with me because I was like, I know them, and I'll talk to them for a few minutes. Of course, while I'm doing this at work or other places, my mind is racing 100 miles per hour, especially this week. I was trying to get everything settled for our new schedule. And at any given moment along my journey back and forth between taking kids to classes and back to the therapy room, I'm thinking about my Wednesday night lesson, next Sunday morning sermon, a person at church I haven't been able to talk to in a while, thinking about the next kid that I have to see, and do I have everything I need for that treatment session? I'm thinking about an evaluation I have to perform at some point before the end of the week, and that's just in one 5-minute walk, the stuff that goes in my head. So what inevitably happens is that someone will greet me with a passing, and they'll say, hello. And of course, my immediate response is, it's going great. How's your day? Has this ever happened to you? Like you think it's the automatic response, but they don't say, how's it going? They just say hello. And you're like, I didn't really do that. And you just keep going, right? You don't stop. And you're like, maybe they didn't catch the fact that I totally didn't say the right thing with that greeting. Or I'll say good morning at 2 p.m. or good afternoon at 10 a.m. I bet none of you know anything about awkward social faux pas, do you? And it's sometimes, it carries over into other things, like when you greet someone and you're not really that close to them and you don't know, it's been a long time, you don't know whether they're going for the handshake or the hug, and sometimes you get the hug shake or the hand hug. It's kind of that strange, awkward kind of interaction that people have. I think we've all kind of been there, and some of you are like, this is the story of my life. I spend my days, and it's funny knowing that most of our churches is a lot of introverted people, that these are the things that play in your head. These are the stuff nightmares are made of for a lot of you. And I think a lot of us, we do that in our day, and then you have this awkward interaction, and what do? We carry it with us the rest of our day and think, boy, I hope they don't think that I'm an idiot. We do that. We all do that. These awkward interactions happen a lot. It's funny sometimes in the course of my day or life when people first meet me and they don't, because I have a day job and they don't know I'm a pastor, and so they'll meet me and they figure out I'm a pastor, and it kind of changes the way they interact with you because they're like, oh, he's a pastor. And so they immediately, they may have been a lot more open with you at the front end, but then they realize that you're a pastor. And then what's funny is when people say swear words, but they're not even real swear words, and then they apologize for it. I'm kind of like, okay. People get kind of awkward around pastors sometimes. What they don't know is that most of the time, as a pastor, my prayer is when I interact with people is, please, I hope they don't think I'm some weird Christian holy roller. That's my great fear, and that's always playing in my mind when I first meet people. We're all afraid, I think, of saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. We don't want to say anything too strange or outlandish, lest someone look a little differently at us. Now, what's funny, as we've journeyed along through together as a church and we've studied various teachings of Jesus, we found that Jesus actually seems to thrive on saying awkward stuff. Stuff that was meant to either push people's buttons or put them in a state of confusion. Stuff that even made his own disciples scratch their heads. And that's where we are today in John chapter 6, verses 51 through 59. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. Then the Jews began to argue sharply among themselves, "How can this man give us his flesh to eat?" Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life. Then I will raise them up at the last day. For my flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in them. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Your ancestors ate manna and died, but whoever feeds on this bread will live forever." So, if you remember a few months back, I did some of the I am statements of Jesus found in the Gospel of John. And this is kind of where Jesus kind of reinforces a statement he made a few verses earlier. And I remember that sermon well because I was in the beginning phases of a diet that I had to do for health reasons. And carbs were out during that diet. And I remember that sermon well because I thought that communion bread was the best thing ever. Because, I mean, you're not going to not take communion when you're on a diet, right? So I remember that sermon where Jesus said, "I am the bread of life." Now, for that sermon, when we used that preceding passage, which were verses 35 through 50, it was easy to keep this comparison metaphorical. But here in verse 51, it's like Jesus takes this theme to a whole other level. He tells his disciples and these other assorted listeners that, oh no, this isn't just some metaphorical statement. You literally have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. Now keep in mind, we're going through the lectionary, and this was the reading for this week that I got. And so I'm pondering this all week long because, in the modern state of the entertainment world, the thing that pops into my head unbidden are zombies and vampires. That's what I think of when I think eat my flesh, drink my blood. Sorry, I guess it's just product of our modern world. I'm thinking, wow. So we might actually be more popular, I think, as a church if we maybe spun it that way. If we were like the first church of zombie or vampires, we could probably get a lot of people in here. I don't know. The Church of the Walking Dead. I don't just come up with that. In fact, so the thing is a lot of times we read these passages, we think, oh, well, it must have been readily understood by the people around him. No, for them it was just as awkward and weird as it is for us today. They were completely confused, as in what the Jewish people around him said, "How can this guy give us his flesh to eat?" And that's a little creepy. In fact, some of the earliest misunderstandings that the church had whenever they were first starting out after Jesus had left and they were doing missionary work and they were growing all over the Roman Empire, there were numerous letters written by Roman governors or people in government about these Christians. And there were all these misconceptions. Number one, they thought they were atheists because they refused to do any type of obeisance or give acknowledgement to the Roman gods, which being an atheist back then was terrible because you had to believe in something. They also said that they were cannibals because they always talked about having this supper where they ate the flesh of their leader and drank his blood, which totally offended the Romans. So there was this misunderstanding even back then about what is Jesus talking about whenever they were participating in this communion. Now, we've been through different times when Jesus says strange and hard things. And any of Jesus' parables that we've covered in the past, they come to mind. But this statement that he says, it's just really strange and awkward. And I can picture whenever Jesus starts saying it, and I think this happened a lot probably with the disciples. He says stuff like this and they start laughing nervously and looking around at each other going, ha ha, ha ha, Jesus. You ever done that when somebody says something, you're in a discussion group and somebody says something and you all start looking around going, did he really just say that? Should we laugh? Is it funny? Is it serious? I don't know. I get the picture that the disciples do that a lot with the stuff Jesus said. Maybe they had this perplexed look on their faces going, I'm confused again. Maybe they were hoping that he would turn it into some sort of metaphor or a simile, or give some sort of explanation about the phrase, as he sometimes did with his other parables. Maybe they were thinking he misspoke and hoped that he would maybe walk back this whole eat my flesh business. Now, of course, what happens is Jesus' critics, who always seem to be right there in the middle of whatever Jesus is doing, jump all over this one. How can this fellow give us his flesh to eat? But no, what does Jesus do here? Does he jump into some theological discussion about the symbolism of his statement about flesh and blood? No. He actually doubles down on the statement about the wording of what he says. Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. I picture when he does this that there's even a more awkward silence that happens. And the disciples are looking at each other going, are they fixing to take him away somewhere? I confess that the first time I read through this passage this week, because I have my handy-dandy new note-taker Bible, so the first time I read through this passage, you can look in the margins, I wrote in the margins, what the heck does this mean? With 3 question marks and an exclamation point. That's where I was at the first of the week when I read this passage. I pondered the play of this phrase, because when I write my sermons, I write them on Friday mornings, and I have kind of a ritual that I do. And I pondered it for almost 2 full cups of tea and 2 loads of laundry without even beginning to write anything down. If you do the math, that's like 2 hours of sermon prep time where I didn't even write anything because this was just totally playing around in my head. I was afraid that if I started typing something, I would miss some important nugget. And I didn't want to get locked into a trail of thought and then have to walk it back. So while I was struggling by hour 2 with this whole situation, it hit me. What I was doing while I was pondering and turning over this phrase in my head, exploring what Jesus meant by this phrase, I was doing it. I was eating the flesh of Jesus. I was digging deep, trying to figure out what it meant. If I may be so bold and use the same language of Jesus, I was eating his flesh. Now, before we go any further, I want to be clear. I don't think Jesus was talking literally here. Thank goodness, right? But I don't think he was exaggerating either. Let me kind of explain. So for Jesus, this life in him wasn't something that happened to you once and was done, but something that you experienced day in and day out. And what is one thing that every human being on the planet does every day if they can? Eat and drink. All of us, every single one of us, has to take in water and nutrition or we die. Jesus isn't exaggerating here. For faith to really and truly work, simple belief isn't enough. It isn't enough to believe in the nourishing power of fried chicken. Looking at it does not feed you. Studying it won't sustain you. Smelling it won't make you feel full. In fact, it usually has the opposite effect. You want to eat the fried chicken. Looking at it doesn't feed you. You have to eat it. And let's face it, we really want to as well. I know now you're all thinking about fried chicken for lunch, aren't you? It's why I personally, when I'm on my school days, I eat lunch at 11 a.m. with the 4th graders. Because that's the earliest lunch available. And so I feel like if they're eating then, I can eat my lunch then. Because I'm usually hungry because my oatmeal runs out about 9 o'clock and I'm trying to be good about my eating and stuff. And I have to eat again because I'm really hungry. What Jesus is saying here is that life with him is something to be experienced regularly. To stay nourished, you have to partake in this Jesus life regularly. Now, I mentioned one example of this through my sermon prep. I was forced to turn over this saying of Jesus again and again in my mind. And I'm not fully convinced even at this point as I share this sermon with you today that I've explored all the ways that this phrase has meaning. But through turning it over in my head, through wrestling with it, through, dare I say, consuming it, I was changed by the words. But that's only one way. Another component of eating is the communal part of it. I mean, we can eat alone, but do we really enjoy it? Don't our best meal experiences happen in the company of family and friends? Jesus shows up when people live in community together, when they worship together, when they serve together, or they just be together. All of that is what sustains us. We are feasting on Jesus every time we gather together in a real spirit of lifting each other up. And there is real, tangible strength and life in it. Is it always easy? Of course not. And in fact, when the people realize when they were listening to Jesus, they realized what he was saying, many of them left. As the next few verses will attest to that, but we're going to talk about that next week. It's far easier to live a flat life and ignore the divine, ignore the call of Jesus to a life with him. It's way easier to feed ourselves on the junk food of overwork, mass consumerism, blind nationalism, and escapism through chemical substances. Those things, they never really fully satisfy the deep hunger of life, though. Like real junk food, they may fill you up, but in the end they kill you. I am the living bread. Now, it's no coincidence that I decided to do communion today. I love the participatory nature of the service. And I love communion. I made a resolution this past year to practice it more often. Because I think when we physically eat these elements, they serve as a very real, tangible reminder of what it means to live a life dedicated to following Jesus. So if somebody want to go make the round and get the kiddos.